He thought his money gave him the right to crush anyone. When the spoiled rich kid slammed the young waitress's face into a table just for spilling a drop of sauce, he laughed, thinking he was untouchable. He was wrong. Suddenly, the door flew open and the room went ice cold. A Navy SEAL and his 90-pound German Shepherd walked in. The bully had just made the biggest mistake of his life, and the justice about to be served would change this town forever. The sun hung directly overhead like a polished brass coin, harsh and relentless, baking the asphalt of Blackwater Creek until the very air seemed to shimmer in a distorted haze of heat. It was high noon in this Ohio lakeside town, but the usual cooling breeze off Lake Erie seemed to have abandoned the streets, leaving a heavy, humid stillness that clung to skin and clothes. The town smelled of low tide, drying algae, and the faint, acrid tang of diesel smoke from the ore freighters idling lazily in the industrial port. It was the kind of weather that made movement sluggish and tempers short, where shadows lay stark and unforgiving against the bleached concrete. At the heart of this sweltering tableau was the Anchor Grill, a diner that had weathered decades of economic storms and downturns. Its windows were plastered with flyers for local fish fries and high school football games, and its open sign hummed with a neon determination against the glaring daylight. Inside, the diner was a pocket of bustling life, filled with dock workers seeking air-conditioned refuge, retired factory men nursing bottomless cups of coffee, and families trying to escape the midday sun. The structure itself looked tired but resilient, much like its patrons, with salt and wind-scoured siding and a roof that had seen better days. In the far corner of the diner's gravel and asphalt parking lot, seeking the only shelter the outside world offered, a massive black F-150 idled with a low, rhythmic rumble beneath the gnarled branches of an ancient oak tree. The truck was coated in a layer of road dust, evidence of a long cross-country journey, yet the engine purred with the precision of a well-maintained machine. Standing by the open passenger door was Caleb Cal Rourke. He was a man who seemed to take up more space than his physical size suggested, standing 6'3" with broad shoulders that strained the fabric of his simple gray t-shirt. Cal was a Navy SEAL on active leave, and even in this relaxed setting, he carried an air of coiled, potential energy. His skin was tanned from years of exposure to the elements, and his hair was cut in a functional, military short style. His face was a map of hard-won experience, with a square jaw and dark, flint-colored eyes that swept the perimeter with an unconscious, habitual vigilance. He was not a man who fidgeted. Every one of his movements was economical and precise. Right now, those movements were dedicated to pouring bottled water into a collapsible bowl for his companion. Shadow, a magnificent German Shepherd with a sleek coat of sable and black, lapped at the water with intense focus. The dog was large for his breed, with a deep chest and intelligent, amber eyes that mirrored his owner's watchfulness. Shadow was more than a pet, he was a trained working animal, accustomed to high-stress environments. Here, though, in the shade of the oak, he exhibited a calm discipline, ignoring a stray cat that slinked under a nearby fence. Cal watched the dog drink, his hand resting lightly on the animal's muscled neck in a silent communication of bond and reassurance. They had been driving for hours, heading north to visit family, and this stop in Blackwater Creek was meant to be nothing more than a brief respite for coffee and a stretch. Cal reached into the truck bed to adjust a strap on his duffel bag, ensuring everything was secure. He moved with a quiet grace that belied his size, the day's heat seeming not to affect him, as if he had endured environments far more punishing than a sunny Ohio afternoon. The lazy, heavy air of the lot was suddenly shattered, not by the cry of a gull or the horn of a boat, but by the guttural, arrogant roar of a high-performance engine. Cal didn't flinch, but his head turned slowly, his eyes narrowing slightly as a cherry-red Maserati convertible whipped around the corner and screeched into the lot at an unnecessary speed. The car was an alien object in this landscape, a gleaming symbol of excess among the rusted sedans and dented work trucks of the locals. It looked like a fresh drop of blood on a faded canvas. The driver revved the engine one more time, a boastful snarl that echoed off the diner's walls before cutting the ignition. The silence that followed felt heavier than before. The driver's side door swung open and Spencer Sterling Jr. emerged. He was a young man in his early 20s who wore his wealth like a suit of armor. He was dressed in a tailored, cream-colored linen suit that was perfectly impractical for the gritty lakeside town. His blonde hair was slicked back with enough product to withstand a hurricane, and his face, soft and unlined, wore a permanent expression of entitled boredom. Spencer adjusted his expensive sunglasses and surveyed the parking lot with a sneer, as if the very air of Blackwater Creek offended his lungs. He walked around to the passenger side, not to open the door for his companion, but to check his car for any specks of dust. The passenger door opened, and Madison Croft appeared. She was a striking woman, though her beauty was hardened by a veneer of practiced arrogance. She wore a pristine white sundress that looked as if it had never seen a wrinkle, and her accessories, a designer handbag and oversized sunglasses, screamed high-end city boutiques. Her dark hair was styled in perfect, loose waves, and she immediately put a hand up to shield her face from the sun, wincing as the humidity hit her. Cal, standing in the oak shade some 50 feet away, watched them with a detached curiosity. He saw the way Spencer snapped his fingers for Madison to hurry up, and the way she sighed audibly, brushing an invisible speck of dust from her shoulder. They were a stark contrast to the tired, hard-working folks Cal had seen entering the diner earlier. "It's suffocating out here," Madison complained, her voice carrying across the lot with a sharp, whining quality. "I told you we should have stopped at the country club in the last town. This place looks like it hasn't passed a health inspection since the 90s. Spencer laughed, a sound devoid of warmth. "Relax, babe. We're just grabbing a quick bite. Besides, my father is looking at buying up this whole waterfront. I want to see if it's worth bulldozing or if we should just burn it for the insurance money." He kicked at a loose piece of gravel with his Italian leather loafers, eyeing the diner with a predatory amusement. "Come on, let's see if they know what sparkling water is or if they only serve tap water and disappointment." Shadow lifted his head, his ears perking as he tracked the couple's movements. A low, almost inaudible rumble started in the dog's throat, not quite a growl, but a vibration of warning. Cal placed a reassuring hand on Shadow's head, silencing him instantly. "Easy, boy," Cal murmured, his voice a low baritone. He didn't like them. He didn't like the way the man walked with his chest puffed out, looking for someone to intimidate, nor the way the woman looked at the world as if it existed solely for her convenience. But Cal was a man of discipline. He wasn't a cop, and he wasn't a vigilante. He was just a traveler passing through. As long as they kept their arrogance to themselves, he'd stay in the shade. He watched Spencer and Madison make their way to the entrance of the Anchor Grill. Spencer shoved the door open with his shoulder, not bothering to hold it for an older man who was just stepping out, forcing the old-timer to shuffle quickly out of the way to avoid being hit. Madison followed, her nose wrinkled as if she could smell the grease fryer from outside. The door swung shut behind them, swallowing the bright red and white of their outfits into the diner's dim interior. Cal remained by his truck, the heat waves rising from the asphalt distorting the air around the diner's entrance. He picked up his water bottle and took a long drink, his eyes still fixed on the door. He had an instinct for trouble. He could smell it on the wind like ozone before a thunderstorm. And the two people who had just walked inside carried a storm cloud with them. He capped his water and looked down at Shadow. "Give them a minute, buddy," Cal said quietly. "Then we'll go get that coffee." He had no desire to share a space with them, but the road ahead was long, and he needed the caffeine. Cal leaned back against the warm metal of the truck, crossing his arms over his chest, content to wait a few more minutes in the oppressive heat, unaware that the quiet atmosphere of the diner was about to be shattered, and his peaceful leave was about to take a violent turn. The interior of the Anchor Grill offered a stark sensory contrast to the sweltering, bright heat of the parking lot, though it possessed a heavy atmosphere of its own. The air conditioner hummed with a desperate, rattling rhythm, circulating air that smelled of frying bacon, strong coffee, and the faint, sweet scent of maple syrup. Motes of dust danced in the sunbeams that cut through the Venetian blinds, illuminating the worn linoleum floor and the vinyl booths that were cracked with age and use. For the regulars, this place was a sanctuary, a familiar living room where the coffee was endless and the gossip flowed freely. Navigating this ecosystem was Leah Carter, a 22-year-old waitress who moved with a practiced, weary efficiency. Leah was petite with strawberry blonde hair pulled back into a functional, messy bun that failed to contain the humidity-induced tendrils curling around her face. Her uniform, a pale blue dress with a white apron, was clean but frayed at the hem, a testament to how many shifts it had seen. There were dark circles under her hazel eyes, shadows painted by double shifts and sleepless nights worrying over the growing pile of medical bills on her kitchen counter for her grandmother's heart medication. Despite her exhaustion, Leah possessed a natural warmth, offering a tired but genuine smile to old Mr. Henderson as she refilled his mug for the third time, asking about his grandkids with sincere interest. The rhythmic clatter of cutlery and the low murmur of conversation was abruptly cut as the front door opened, admitting a blast of hot air and the two new arrivals. Spencer Sterling Jr. and Madison Croft didn't wait to be seated. They swept past the "Please wait to be seated" sign with the assurance of people who owned every room they entered, commandeering a large booth by the window that had just been vacated by a family of four. Leah, balancing a heavy tray loaded with the fisherman's special plates of fried cod, coleslaw, and French fries, took a deep breath and adjusted her course. She knew this type. Blackwater Creek didn't get many tourists in Italian suits and designer dresses, but when they did show up, they often treated the locals like part of the scenery. As she neared their table, she could already hear Madison's voice, sharp and complaining, cutting through the ambient noise like a serrated knife. "This table is sticky, Spencer. My elbow is literally sticking to the wood. It's disgusting." Spencer, who was busy admiring his reflection in the back of a spoon, waved a dismissive hand. "Try not to touch anything, babe, we'll eat fast and get out of here." Leah approached the table, her arms trembling slightly under the weight of the tray she was carrying for a table just beyond them. She managed a polite smile, intending to set the food down at the adjacent booth before taking their order. "I'll be right with you folks," she said softly, her voice raspy from hours of talking. As she passed their booth, the narrow aisle between tables became a treacherous path. Spencer, looking bored and malicious, stretched his long legs out into the aisle, his expensive loafer hooking perfectly around Leah's ankle. It was not an accident. The smirk on his face as he watched her approach confirmed the intent. He was bored, and in his world, other people were simply toys for his amusement. Leah's foot caught the obstruction squarely. She gasped, lurching forward, her balance completely gone. She made a valiant effort to right herself, to save the tray, but gravity was merciless. The tray tipped. A small ramekin filled with bright red cocktail sauce flew off the edge of a plate, arcing through the air in a perfect, horrifying parabola before landing squarely in the middle of Madison Croft's pristine white sundress. The impact was wet and final. A crimson stain bloomed instantly against the white fabric, looking shocking and violent in the sunlit diner. For a heartbeat, there was absolute silence. The entire diner seemed to hold its breath at once. Then Madison screamed. It was a high, piercing shriek of pure rage that made several customers jump in their seats. "You clumsy, stupid idiot!" Madison shrieked, leaping to her feet, the sauce dripping onto the floor. Leah, who had managed to catch herself on the edge of the table to keep from falling completely, was horrified. Her face went pale, her hands shaking uncontrollably. "Oh my God, I am so sorry," Leah stammered, fumbling for a wad of napkins from her apron. "I didn't mean to. I tripped. Let me help you." She instinctively reached out to blot at the stain, a gesture of pure panic and helpfulness. "Don't you touch me," Madison screeched. And then, with a speed fueled by self-importance and fury, she swung. The slap echoed through the diner like a gunshot. It was a hard, open-handed blow across Leah's cheek that snapped her head to the side. The force of it sent Leah staggering back, clutching her stinging face, tears of shock welling instantly in her eyes. The diner erupted in gasps. Old Mr. Henderson started to struggle out of his booth, his face red with indignation, but his arthritic knees were slow. "Hey," someone shouted from the counter. But before anyone could intervene, Spencer moved. He didn't move to calm his girlfriend or apologize. He moved, instead, seeing an opportunity to perform, to assert his dominance in front of these local yokels. He rose to his feet, his face twisting into an ugly mask of aggression. "You ruined her dress," he snarled, his voice dropping to a menacing growl. He stepped forward, closing the space between him and the terrified waitress. "Do you have any idea what that cost? It's worth more than your life." He reached out, his hand grabbing a violent fistful of Leah's strawberry blonde hair. Leah cried out in pain as he jerked her head forward. With one brutal shove, Spencer forced her upper body down, slamming her face into the hard, sticky varnish of the wooden tabletop. The impact rattled the silverware and sent the sugar dispenser sliding across the surface. He didn't let go. He held her head there, his fingers tightening in her hair, his other hand pressing down on her shoulder to keep her pinned. "You're going to apologize," Spencer hissed, leaning down so his mouth was close to her ear, his breath hot and smelling of mint. "And then you're going to get on your knees and clean it up. Look what you did. Look at it." Leah was sobbing, her cheek pressed against the table, helpless and terrified, her hands scrabbling uselessly at the table's edge. The cruelty was absolute, a public execution of her dignity. The patrons were frozen in a mixture of horror and disbelief. The violence had escalated so quickly their minds were struggling to catch up. A few of the men were getting to their feet, anger replacing shock, but they were old, and Spencer was young and built. It was at that precise moment of supreme injustice, just as Spencer applied more pressure to the crying girl's neck, that the bell over the front door chimed. It was a cheerful, welcoming sound, utterly at odds with the scene inside. The heavy door swung inward, all the way open. The blinding white light of the midday sun flooded the entryway, momentarily dazzling everyone looking that way. But then the light was blotted out. A massive figure stepped into the frame, eclipsing the sun, casting a long, imposing shadow that stretched across the linoleum floor all the way to Spencer's feet. It was a wall of a man, wide and silent, and at his side was the distinct, sharp-eared silhouette of a large canine. The man didn't rush. He didn't yell. He just stood there, radiating a terrifying calm that immediately sucked all the oxygen out of the room. The air conditioner still rattled, but for everyone in the Anchor Grill, the temperature seemed to have dropped 20 degrees. The shadow had arrived, and it was looking directly at Spencer Sterling Jr. The silence that fell over the Anchor Grill was absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket that snuffed out the low hum of the refrigerators and the distant rattle of the air conditioner. It felt as if the world had held its breath in anticipation of violence. Cal Rourke stepped fully into the room, the door closing slowly behind him with a soft pneumatic hiss that sounded like a final warning. He didn't shout. He didn't run. He moved with a frightening fluidity that seemed impossible for a man his size, his boots making no sound on the worn linoleum. To the stunned patrons, he looked like a force of nature that had just blown in off the lake, dark and inexorable. At his side, Shadow moved in perfect, silent synchronicity. The German Shepherd didn't bark. Barking was for warnings, and the time for warnings had passed the moment Spencer Sterling Jr. had laid hands on the young waitress. Shadow lowered his head, his ears flattening against his skull, transforming from a loyal companion into a precision instrument of intimidation. The dog's amber eyes locked onto Spencer's exposed legs, and a low vibration began in his chest. A sound so deep it was felt in the floorboards more than heard. Spencer, still hunched over the table with his hand knotted in Leah's hair, was the last to realize the atmosphere had changed. He was too drunk on his own petty power, too focused on the sobbing girl beneath his hand. "Did you hear me?" Spencer taunted at the back of Leah's head, oblivious to the shadow falling over him. "I said apologize." But the words died in his throat as a sudden, primal shiver ran down his spine. It was the instinct of a prey animal sensing a predator. He started to turn his head, annoyed at the interruption, expecting maybe a manager or another old local he could verbally swat down. Instead, he found himself staring into the wet, black nose of a 90-pound German Shepherd. Shadow was inches from his face, lips curled back just enough to reveal gleaming white canines that promised catastrophic damage. The low rumble escalated, a jagged tear in the silence that made Spencer freeze, his muscles locking up in pure, unadulterated terror. Before Spencer could process the threat of the dog, a hand clamped down on his shoulder. It wasn't a grip. It was a vice, feeling more like industrial machinery than flesh and bone. Cal stood directly behind him, his face a mask of stone. There was no anger in Cal's eyes, which was somehow more frightening than boundless rage. There was only a cold, calculating assessment, the look of a man who had eliminated insurgents in war zones and was now looking at a minor annoyance. Cal's fingers found the sensitive bundle of nerves between Spencer's neck and shoulder, a pressure point known intimately to men trained to neutralize threats without leaving permanent marks. He didn't squeeze. He simply applied devastating, targeted pressure. The effect was instantaneous. A jolt of electric pain shot down Spencer's arm, bypassing his conscious thought and triggering a biological imperative. His hand, which had been clenched in Leah's hair, involuntarily flew open as his knees buckled. Spencer let out a strangled yelp, a high-pitched sound of shock that shamed him even as it left his lips. "Let her go," Cal said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a resonance that vibrated in the chests of everyone in the room. It was a command, not a request. He increased the pressure on the nerve bundle by a fraction of an inch, forcing Spencer to pivot away from the table, away from Leah, and toward the floor. The young heir to the Sterling fortune, who moments before had been preening like a king, was now writhing in agony, on his toes to try and relieve the searing pain radiating from his shoulder. "I let go. I let go. You're breaking my shoulder," Spencer squealed, his face pale, sweat instantly beading on his forehead. Cal guided him backward with effortless control, moving him away from his victim as one might move a recalcitrant child, albeit with a significantly greater threat of violence. He only released the pressure when Spencer was clear of the booth, giving him a slight push that sent him staggering back against the counter, clutching his arm and gasping for air. Shadow stepped forward, placing himself between Spencer and the booth, a living barrier of muscle and teeth. Across the table, Madison Croft reacted with the instinct of her generation. Seeing her boyfriend neutralized and humiliated, she didn't rush to his aid. Instead, she reached into her designer handbag and fumbled for her smartphone, her weapon of choice. She pulled it out, her thumb hovering over the record button, her face twisting into a mask of indignant victimhood. "I'm recording this," she shrieked, her voice shaky but shrill. "You just assaulted him. I am going to ruin you. Do you have any idea who we are? The internet will see this and you'll be in jail before sundown." She raised the phone, pointing the camera lens at Cal's face, ready to frame the narrative, ready to turn the soldier into the villain. Cal slowly turned his head to look at her. He didn't lunge for the phone. He didn't speak. He simply directed the full weight of his gaze at her. It was a 1,000-yard stare, a look born from seeing things Madison couldn't even nightmare about. It was a look that stripped away the veneer of civilization and polite society and exposed the raw, dangerous reality underneath. In that gaze, Madison saw something that terrified her more than any threat. She saw a man who didn't care about her money, her followers, or her social standing. She saw a man who could end her existence in seconds and sleep soundly afterward. The sheer, overwhelming intensity of his presence crashed against her fragile arrogance. Her hands started to tremble, just slightly at first, then violently. The bravado evaporated, leaving a cold vacuum of fear. Her fingers went numb, and the sleek, expensive smartphone slipped from her grasp. It hit the linoleum floor with a loud, pathetic clatter and slid under the table. Madison didn't move to get it. She shrank back into the vinyl booth, her mouth opening and closing silently, pinned in place by the stranger's gray, flint-like eyes. With the threats neutralized, the tension in Cal's frame dissipated instantly, replaced by a gentle urgency. He turned his back on the cowering couple, dismissing them as if they were no longer relevant, and looked down at Leah. The young waitress was still slumped over the table, trembling, her hands covering her face, small sobs shaking her thin shoulders. The red cocktail sauce stain on Madison's dress was forgotten. The humiliation and the physical pain of having her hair pulled were the only things real to her at that moment. Cal reached out, his large hand, the same one that had just incapacitated Spencer with a touch, hovering for a second to ensure he wouldn't startle her before it rested gently on her shoulder. "It's over," he said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming as soft and rumbling as distant thunder. "You're safe, ma'am." Leah looked up, her eyes red-rimmed and wide with shock. She saw the mountain of a man standing over her, blocking out the harsh sun, creating a safe shadow. She saw the concern etched into his rugged features, a stark contrast to the cruelty she had just endured. Cal reached for the napkin dispenser, pulled out a handful of tissues, and offered them to her. It was a small, mundane gesture, but in the context of the violence, it felt monumentally kind. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his eyes scanning her face for bruises. Leah took the tissues with trembling fingers, dabbing at the tears on her cheeks. She shook her head mutely, unable to form words, but the gratitude in her eyes said everything. Cal offered her his hand. She hesitated, then placed her small, calloused hand in his. He pulled her to her feet with ease, steadying her as she swayed on unsteady legs. Turning back to the room, Cal looked at Spencer and Madison. Spencer was rubbing his shoulder, his eyes darting between Cal and the door, looking for an escape, but too proud to make a run for it just yet. Madison was clutching her purse, staring at her ruined dress and the floor where her phone lay. "Get out," Cal said. The command was simple. It wasn't yelled. It was spoken with the finality of a judge passing sentence. "Pay for their meal. Leave a tip, and get out before I decide you're a threat to the safety of this establishment." You can't order us around," Spencer stammered, though he was already backing toward the door, his survival instinct overriding his ego. Shadow took one step forward and let out a single, sharp bark that sounded like a gunshot in the enclosed space. Spencer nearly jumped a foot in the air. We're going. He yelped, throwing a wad of cash on the counter without counting it. He didn't wait for Madison. He bolted for the door, shoving it open and stumbling out into the glaring heat. Madison, realizing she was alone with the monster and his beast, snatched her phone and scrambled after him, her heels clicking frantically on the floor. The door swung shut, and for a moment, the diner was silent again. Then, as if a spell had been broken, the patrons let out a collective breath. Old Mr. Henderson clapped his hands once, a sharp sound of approval, and suddenly the diner was filled with murmurs of awe and relief. Cal didn't acknowledge the accolades. He just looked at Leah, his expression softening. "You okay?" he asked again, ignoring the hero worship that was building around him, focused only on the civilian he had sworn to protect. The relief inside the Anchor Grill was short-lived. The fragile bubble of peace shattered the moment the distant wail of a police siren cut through the humid afternoon air. It started as a low, indistinct hum, indistinguishable from the wind, but quickly escalated into a sharp, rhythmic shriek that grew louder with each passing second. Cal Rourke, who had been quietly helping Leah pick up the spilled silverware, straightened up. He knew that sound intimately. It was the sound of authority arriving. But in a town like this, authority often arrived with baggage. He looked at Leah, whose face had gone pale all over again. "Stay here," he told her, his voice calm and reassuring. "Don't come outside until I say it's clear." He gave Shadow a subtle hand signal, a command to stay, and turned toward the door. He wasn't going to let this confrontation happen inside amongst the glass and innocent bystanders. He pushed the door open and stepped out into the oppressive heat of the day, just as a dusty sheriff's department cruiser skidded into the parking lot, its lights flashing red and blue against the bright sun. The cruiser stopped at an angle, blocking the exit for Cal's truck. The driver's side door opened and Sheriff Brody Jones heaved himself out. Jones was a man in his late 50s who looked like he'd been fighting a losing battle with gravity and cholesterol for decades. He was thick-set, his brown uniform straining over a belly that spilled over a gun belt more loaded with tactical gear than a small-town sheriff would ever need. His face was a florid, unhealthy red, beaded with sweat that dripped from under his Stetson hat. He had the look of a man who loved the power of his badge, but hated the physical exertion required to enforce it. He adjusted the belt, which seemed to be cutting into his hips, and marched toward the diner entrance, his hand instinctively resting on the butt of his holstered sidearm. Spencer Sterling Jr., who had been pacing furiously by his red convertible, saw his salvation had arrived. He transformed instantly. The arrogance vanished, replaced by a display of exaggerated victimhood that would have been impressive if it weren't so pathetic. He limped forward, though his leg was uninjured, clutching his shoulder as if it were hanging by a thread. "Sheriff! Sheriff! Thank God you're here!" Spencer cried, his voice breaking with feigned emotion. "He's a maniac. He attacked me. I was just sitting here having lunch with my girlfriend and this vagrant comes in and assaults me. Look at my shoulder. I think it's dislocated." Madison, taking her cue, rushed to his side, adding her own shrill commentary. "He has a vicious dog, Sheriff. It tried to bite Spencer's face off. He's dangerous. He threatened to kill us." Jones stopped, his eyes flicking from the crying millionaire to the tall figure of Cal, who was standing calmly by the diner door. He didn't ask questions. He didn't assess the scene. He saw a Sterling, the son of the most powerful man in the county, claiming assault, and he saw a stranger who looked like trouble. Jones's face hardened into a scowl. He pointed a thick, accusatory finger at Cal. "Hands where I can see 'em, now," Jones bellowed, his voice coarse and authoritarian. "Step away from the animal and get on your knees." Cal didn't move. He stood with his feet shoulder-width apart, his hands clearly visible, but relaxed at his sides. He did not kneel. He did not flinch. He simply watched Jones with a detached, professional assessment. "I'm not going to do that, Sheriff," Cal said, his voice even and respectful, but firm. "There was an altercation, but I didn't assault anyone. I intervened to stop an assault on a waitress. I didn't ask for your life story, boy. I gave you a direct order," Jones growled, his face turning a shade darker purple. He unsnapped the retaining strap on his holster. "I said, get on your knees and get that beast under control before I call animal control to put a round in it. We don't tolerate dangerous animals in Blackwater Creek." At the mention of a threat to Shadow, a dangerous glint appeared in Cal's eyes, though his body remained still. Shadow, sensing the hostility, let out a low growl, shifting slightly in front of Cal, ready to engage. "The dog is under control, Sheriff," Cal warned, his voice dropping a few decibels. "I suggest you lower your voice. You're escalating a situation that was already resolved." The diner door opened behind Cal and a group of patrons spilled out, led by Mr. Henderson. The old fisherman, leaning on his cane, pointed a trembling finger at Spencer. "That's a lie, Brody. A damn lie," the old man yelled, his voice thin but fierce. "That rich boy was hurting Leah. He was smashing her face on the table. This fella just stopped him. He's a hero." Other voices joined in. A chorus of gray-haired locals defending the stranger. "Don't you listen to a Sterling, Brody. The boy's lying. Leave the man alone." Jones faltered for a second, looking at the crowd of his constituents yelling at him. But then he looked at Spencer Sterling, whose father practically funded the sheriff's re-election campaign. The choice was already made. "Quiet!" Jones roared at the crowd. "All of you get back inside or I'll write every one of you up for obstruction and disturbing the peace. This is a crime scene, not a town meeting." He turned back to Cal, emboldened by his own shouting. "Last warning. On the ground, now." Cal sighed, a short exhalation through his nose. He recognized that logic wasn't going to work on a man like Jones. He needed a different kind of authority. "I'm reaching into my back pocket for my wallet, Sheriff," Cal announced slowly, telegraphing his movements to ensure he wasn't shot by the trigger-happy lawman. "I'm going to show you my identification, and then we're going to have a very different conversation." Jones hesitated, his hand still hovering near his gun. Slowly, Jones hissed. "One wrong move and I'll put you down." Cal moved with deliberate slowness. He reached back, produced a slim, black leather wallet, and flipped it open. He didn't pull out a driver's license. He pulled out a common access card, a CAC, with a specific color code and a second, laminated card behind it bearing the seal of the Department of the Navy and a specific warfare insignia. Cal took 2 steps forward, ignoring Jones's flinch, and held the ID up in the harsh, unforgiving sunlight. "Read it," Cal commanded. The order wasn't shouted, but it carried the weight of the federal government behind it. Jones squinted in the glare, leaning in to look at the card. He saw the rank. He saw the unit designation, Naval Special Warfare Group. He saw the clearance level. The color drained from Jones's face faster than water from a cracked bucket. The sweat on his brow suddenly felt cold. He wasn't looking at a vagrant. He was looking at a petty officer first class, a Navy SEAL, who was technically government property. Arresting him wouldn't just be a paperwork issue. It would bring a firestorm of federal oversight, lawyers, and commanding officers down on Jones's tiny department. The dynamic shifted instantly. The bully in Jones melted away, leaving a terrified public servant. Jones stammered, taking a step back, his hand flying off his gun like it was hot. He looked at Cal, really looked at him this time, and saw the lethal competence he had missed before. I was not aware of your status, sir." Cal slipped the wallet back into his pocket. "Now you are," Cal said coldly. "Mr. Sterling committed assault on a civilian in that establishment. I have multiple witnesses. I suggest you take their statements, and I suggest you tell Mr. Sterling to leave before I decide to file a formal complaint about your conduct, and his." Jones swallowed hard. He looked over at Spencer, who was still waiting for Cal to be put in cuffs. "Sheriff, what are you doing? Arrest him!" Spencer shrieked. Jones turned on the rich boy, his patience snapping under the pressure of his near-fatal mistake. "Shut up, Spencer!" Jones snapped. "Get in your car. Go home, now." Spencer's jaw dropped. "What? My father will hear about this." "Tell your father whatever you want," Jones hissed, lowering his voice so only Spencer could hear. "But get out of here before you land us both in a federal prison. Go." The air in Harrison Sterling Sr.'s executive office was filtered, chilled, and smelled of expensive leather and old money, a stark contrast to the humid, salty reality of the town below. Sterling Sr., patriarch of the family and the puppet master of Blackwater Creek's economy, stood by his floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the very harbor he planned to redevelop. He was a man in his late 50s, his silver hair styled with severe precision, dressed in a charcoal suit that cost more than most of the local fishermen made in a year. His eyes, a pale, icy blue, lacked his son's hot temper, but held a calculating coldness that was far more dangerous. He held the phone to his ear, listening to Spencer Jr.'s frantic, exaggerated account of the incident at the diner. The son whined about a maniac and a wolf. The father heard only incompetence and a threat to the family image. "That's enough, Spencer," Sterling Sr. said, his voice smooth and devoid of empathy. "You let some drifter publicly humiliate you. Stop crying. I'll handle it." He ended the call without saying goodbye. He wasn't interested in the soldier. He was interested in leverage. He dialed a new number, his fingers tapping impatiently on his mahogany desk. The recipient was a Mr. Henderson, a nervous, sweaty man who owned the run-down rental properties on the edge of town. "Henderson," Sterling Sr. said, cutting off the landlord's greeting. "That girl, the waitress, Carter, she rents that little house on Elm Street. I want her out of there, today. Find a clause, make up a violation. I don't care. Just put her on the street." He hung up, satisfied that the problem was being dealt with, not with a fist, but with a signature. Back at the Anchor Grill, the adrenaline had faded, replaced by a weary reality. Cal Scott had insisted on paying for everyone's meal, a gesture that had earned him quiet nods of respect from the regulars, but his focus remained on Leah. She was in the back splashing cold water on her face, trying to compose herself. When she emerged, she looked fragile, emotionally bruised, but not broken. As she reached for her apron, however, her pocket buzzed. She pulled out her cracked smartphone, and as she listened to the voice on the other end, Cal watched the color drain completely from her face. She didn't cry this time. She just looked hollowed out. "I understand," she whispered into the phone, her voice trembling. "But today, I don't have anywhere to go." A pause. "Yes, I understand." She lowered the phone, looking at Cal with eyes that had lost all hope. "My landlord," she said, her voice barely audible over the clatter of dishes. "He says there have been complaints, about noise, about sanitation. He's evicting us. He says I have to be out by sunset or the sheriff will be back." Cal didn't need to be a detective to connect the dots. The timing was too immediate, the cruelty too specific. Get your things, Cal said, his voice leaving no room for argument. I'll take you home. The drive to the outskirts of Blackwater Creek was quiet. Shadow sat in the back seat of the truck, his head resting on the console, occasionally nudging Leah's elbow with his wet nose as if sensing her distress. Leah gave Cal directions, leading him away from the waterfront and into a neighborhood where the sidewalks were cracked and the grass grew wild. They pulled up in front of a small, tired-looking bungalow that seemed to be trying to hold itself together. The paint, once a cheerful yellow, was peeling in long strips, and the front porch sagged noticeably to the left, but there were flower boxes filled with vibrant marigolds, and the windows were spotlessly clean. It was a home that was loved, even if it was falling apart. Cal put the truck in park, and before he could open the door, he saw movement on the porch. An old woman sat in a worn, manual wheelchair, a knitted shawl draped over her shoulders despite the heat. This was Eleanor, Leah's grandmother. Her hair was a cloud of snow white, and her face was a map of deep lines, but her eyes were sharp and clear, possessing the same hazel warmth as her granddaughter's. She watched the strange truck pull up with a wary curiosity. Cal got out, followed by Shadow. He signaled for the dog to stay close. Leah hurried up the walkway, trying to hide her distress. "Grandma, it's okay. We have a guest." The lie was clumsy. Eleanor looked from Leah's red-rimmed eyes to the giant of a man walking up her driveway. "A guest?" Eleanor asked, her voice raspy but strong. "He looks more like a walking tank, and he brought a bear with him." Cal smiled, a genuine expression that softened the hard lines of his face. "Caleb Rourke, ma'am," he said, removing his sunglasses. "And this is Shadow. We had a little trouble in town. I thought I should make sure Leah got home safe." Cal didn't leave. He couldn't fix the eviction notice. Not yet. But he could fix the brokenness right in front of him. He saw the way the front gate hung askew on its hinges, a symbol of the vulnerability of the two women who lived there. He saw the rotting step on the porch that threatened to catch a wheelchair tire. "I've got some tools in the truck," Cal announced, rolling up the sleeves of his gray t-shirt, revealing corded forearms. "And I've got a few hours before I need to be anywhere." Leah tried to protest, overwhelmed by the kindness of a stranger, but Eleanor silenced her with a look. "Let the man work, Leah," Eleanor said quietly. "A man needs to do something with his hands when he's angry at the world. And I think Mr. Rourke is very angry at the world right now." Eleanor saw more than she let on. The next 2 hours transformed the grim atmosphere of the little house into something that resembled hope. The late afternoon sun, now a deep honey gold, bathed the front yard in a warm glow. Cal moved with the rhythmic efficiency of a man who treated labor as a form of meditation. He went to his truck, retrieving a heavy toolbox and a stash of spare lumber he kept for emergencies. The sound of a hammer striking nails echoed through the quiet street, a steady, reassuring beat. He rehung the gate, reinforcing the hinges with long screws so that it swung smoothly and latched securely. He replaced the rotting boards on the porch steps, testing his full weight on them to ensure they would hold. Sweat gleamed on his brow and soaked the back of his shirt, but he didn't slow down. He was channeling his frustration with the Sterlings, driving it into the wood with every hammer blow. On the porch, Eleanor sat in her wheelchair, a glass of iced tea in her hand, watching him. Shadow had taken up a post at the bottom of the newly repaired steps, lying in a patch of sun. The big dog was perfectly still, his head on his paws, but his eyes were open, scanning the street. He was on watch. At one point, a squirrel skittered across the lawn, and Shadow's ears twitched, but a soft word from Eleanor made him lie back down. "You're a good boy, aren't you?" she murmured. Shadow thumped his tail once against the ground, acknowledging the praise. It was a scene of peaceful domesticity that stood in stark contrast to the violence in the diner and the sterile coldness of Sterling Sr.'s office. There was no money here, but there was dignity. Leah came out with a glass of water for Cal. She stood by the railing, watching him wipe sawdust from his hands. The sun caught the sweat on his arms, making him look like he was cast in bronze. "You don't have to do this," she said, her voice thick with emotion. We might not even be here tomorrow to use it." Cal took the water, draining it in one long swallow. He looked at the sturdy gate, then out at the horizon where the sun was beginning its descent, casting long shadows. "You'll be here," Cal said, his voice low and certain. "A lease is a contract. Eviction takes 30 days by state law, minimum. He's just trying to scare you. And he just picked a fight with someone who doesn't scare easy." He handed the glass back to her, his fingers brushing against hers. "I'm not leaving town tonight, Leah. Not until this is made right." He glanced at Shadow, then up at Eleanor, who gave him a slight nod, a nod of understanding. In that golden light, Amid the smell of fresh sawdust and blooming marigolds, the soldier was more than a protector. He was a builder, restoring the boundaries that the rich and powerful had tried to tear down. The sun began its final descent into Lake Erie, turning the sky over Blackwater Creek from a brilliant blue to a bruised canvas of fiery oranges, deep purples, and streaks of blood red. The heat of the day still lingered on the asphalt, radiating up in shimmering waves, but the shadows were growing long, stretching like dark fingers across the industrial park near the docks. Cal Rourke had driven his truck down to this eerily quiet section of old shipping yards, looking for a particular kind of treated lumber for Eleanor's porch that the local hardware store didn't carry. The area was a maze of rust-streaked shipping containers stacked 3 high like the building blocks of giants, creating narrow canyons of steel and gloom. The air here tasted different. It was metallic, heavy with the scent of diesel fuel, stagnant seawater, and the rotting wood of old piers. It was a place where business was done after hours, and where eyes watched from the dark corners of warehouses. Cal finished loading the last heavy timber onto his truck bed, securing it with a ratcheting tie-down strap. He wiped the sweat from his brow with his forearm, his movements deliberate and unhurried. Despite being alone, his senses were on high alert. The hairs on the back of his neck were standing up, a primitive warning system honed by years of survival in hostile territories. He was not alone. Shadow, who was sitting patiently in the cab with the window down, made a sound that was less a growl and more a low, warning hum. The dog's ears swiveled toward a stack of red containers to their left. Cal didn't look immediately. He casually walked to the driver's side door as if checking his side mirror, using the reflection to scan the perimeter. Movement. Shadows detaching themselves from shadows. There were 5 of them. They emerged from the gaps between the containers, spreading out in a fan formation designed to cut off his escape. They weren't common street thugs. They moved with a coordination that suggested they were paid to be professional, though their discipline was loose and arrogant. Leading the group was a man who looked like he'd been chiseled out of granite in bad decisions. He was known on the docks as Gage, a former longshoreman turned enforcer for the highest bidder. Gage stood over 6 feet tall with a shaved head and a thick, jagged scar that ran from his ear to his chin. He wore a heavy denim vest over a black hoodie despite the heat, and his hands were wrapped in leather tape, the knuckles studded with metal. The men behind him were smaller, but armed with lengths of pipe, baseball bats, and heavy chains that clinked softly as they walked. Cal turned slowly to face them, leaning casually against the side of his truck. He crossed his arms, looking completely at ease, which seemed to disorient the approaching group. They were used to fear, to panic, to victims begging for mercy. Cal looked at them the way a mechanic looks at a broken engine, a problem to be solved, nothing more. "You boys lost?" Cal asked, his voice calm and even, cutting through the quiet evening air. Gage stopped 10 feet away, spitting a wad of tobacco onto the gravel. He smirked, revealing a row of stained teeth. "Not lost, soldier boy," Gage rasped, his voice sounding like gravel in a blender. "Just taking out the trash. Mr. Sterling sends his regards. He said, you need to learn a lesson about respecting your betters." Gage cracked his knuckles, the sound loud in the stillness. "Orders are simple. We break your legs so you can't walk out of town." A pause. "And the dog?" He pointed a thick finger at the cab where Shadow was now growling audibly. "The dog comes with us. The boss wants a new rug." The mention of Shadow changed the equation instantly. The calm calculation in Cal's eyes hardened into something glacial. He reached through the open window and unlatched the door. "Shadow," Cal commanded softly. "Watch my 6." The black German Shepherd exploded from the truck, landing on the gravel with a snarl that echoed off the steel walls. But he didn't charge blindly. He moved to Cal's left flank, his body low to the ground, teeth bared, waiting for the signal. "Last chance to walk away," Cal said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You don't want to do this." Gage laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "Get him," he growled, signaling his men to attack. It was a mistake. The fight that followed wasn't a brawl. It was a disassembly. The first attacker, a wiry man with a baseball bat, swung wild and high, aiming for Cal's head. Cal didn't back up. He moved into the swing, closing the distance instantly. His left forearm blocked the attacker's wrist, stopping the momentum cold, while his right palm struck the man hard in the solar plexus. The air left the attacker's lungs in a single, whooshing gasp, and he crumpled to the ground. In the same motion, Cal spun, using the falling man as a shield against the second attacker, who was wielding a chain. The chain whipped out, wrapping harmlessly around the first man's legs. Cal grabbed the chain, yanked it hard, and pulled the second man off balance, sending him sprawling face first into the gravel. Shadow was a black blur of controlled fury. A goon with a lead pipe tried to circle around behind Cal. Shadow intercepted him, launching his 90-pound frame into the man's chest. The man went down screaming as Shadow pinned him, his jaws snapping inches from his throat, terrifying him into absolute submission without drawing a drop of blood. The dog was a master of psychological warfare, holding the threat of violence so close that the man froze, dropping his weapon and covering his face. Gage, seeing his crew dismantled in under 10 seconds, roared in frustration and charged. He was a brawler, relying on brute strength and weight. He threw a heavy right hook aimed at Cal's jaw. Cal didn't block it. He ducked under it. Moving with the fluid precision of water, Cal pivoted behind Gage, got a grip on the back of his denim vest and his belt, and used Gage's own forward momentum against him. With a powerful grunt, Cal heaved upward. Gage's feet left the ground. The big man sailed through the air and slammed into the side of a red shipping container with a deafening metal boom. He slid down the steel wall, stunned, the wind knocked out of him. Before Gage could recover, Cal was on him. He didn't strike. He controlled. Cal twisted Gage's arm behind his back, applying pressure to the shoulder joint until Gage cried out in pain, his face pressed into the gravel. "Stay down," Cal ordered, his knee pressing firmly into Gage's spine. The other attackers, seeing their leader so easily defeated, backed away. One looked at Shadow, who was standing over their fallen comrade with a low, rumbling growl, and decided that flight was the only option. They dropped their weapons and ran, their footsteps crunching frantically on the gravel as they disappeared into the maze of containers. Cal didn't pursue. He had what he needed. He reached into Gage's back pocket and pulled out a cracked smartphone. "Let's see who signed your check," Cal muttered. He took Gage's thumb and pressed it firmly against the sensor to unlock the screen. The screen lit up in the fading light. Cal navigated to the messages. There it was, a text chain from a contact labeled Spencer Jr. The last message, sent 20 minutes ago, read, "Make sure he can't walk. Bring the dog to the Marina warehouse. Dad wants this done before the charity gala tomorrow. No mistakes." Cal took a screenshot with his own phone, securing the evidence. He stood up, releasing Gage. The big man groaned, clutching his shoulder, too broken to fight back. "You tell Sterling," Cal said, looking down at him with contempt, "that he just made a tactical error. He didn't hire a hit squad. He just delivered the evidence I needed." Cal whistled. "Shadow, heel." The dog immediately left the terrified goon he was pinning and trotted to Cal's side, his tail giving a slight wag as if they had just finished a game of fetch. Cal turned his back on the groaning men and walked toward his truck. The sun had now completely set, leaving the sky a deep, bruised purple. The yard lights flickered on, casting long, eerie shadows across the docks. Cal climbed into the cab, his heart rate barely elevated. He looked at the phone in his hand, the glowing text message a digital smoking gun. This wasn't just about a bully in a diner anymore. It was a conspiracy involving the most powerful family in town. He started the engine, the headlights cutting a swath through the darkness. As he drove out of the docks, leaving the defeated mercenaries in the dust, Cal knew the next battle wouldn't be fought with fists. It would be fought in the light of day, and he was ready to bring the storm right to their front door. The morning sun over Blackwater Creek was not the oppressive, baking heat of the day before. Instead, it was a brilliant, sharp yellow, illuminating the meticulously manicured lawns of the Sterling estate with a picturesque perfection. The estate, a sprawling mansion set on the cliffs overlooking the lake, was the crown jewel of the county, a fortress of white stone and wrought iron. Today, the vast grounds had been transformed into a stage for the annual Blackwater Creek Community Gala, an event ostensibly about charity, but in reality, a pageant of wealth and influence. White tents dotted the green lawn. Tuxedoed waiters moved through the crowds with silver trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres, and a string quartet played Vivaldi in the shade of a gazebo. At the center of this social vortex was Harrison Sterling Sr. He moved through the throngs of local politicians, business partners, and socialites with the ease of a monarch, his shark-like smile fixed in place. At his side was Spencer Jr., his arm in a black silk sling that was entirely unnecessary but added a touch of drama to his story of being attacked by a vagrant. Madison Croft was there too, in a new dress, recounting the horrors of the previous day to a sympathetic clutch of women who were clutching their pearls in feigned horror. The atmosphere was one of supreme self-satisfaction. Sterling Sr. took to the stage, a raised dais decorated with flowers and a massive LED screen that was cycling through images of the family's past charitable donations. He tapped the microphone, the feedback squeal instantly silencing the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sterling Sr. began, his voice smooth and practiced. "We gather here not just to celebrate success, but to safeguard our community. Yesterday, my son was viciously attacked by a dangerous transient. It serves as a reminder that we must be vigilant to keep Blackwater Creek safe and civilized. The crowd murmured in agreement, glancing at Spencer Jr. with pity. But let us not dwell on the darkness, Sterling Sr. continued, raising his glass. Let us focus on the future we are building. It was at that precise moment that the heavy, wrought iron gates at the end of the driveway swung open. They did not open for a guest's luxury sedan. They opened to admit a black, government-issue SUV with tinted windows, escorted by 2 marked State Highway Patrol cruisers. The motorcade moved slowly, ominously up the long driveway, the crunch of gravel under the tires cutting through the classical music. The string quartet faltered and stopped. The conversation died. All eyes turned to the vehicles as they came to a stop at the edge of the lawn. The doors of the SUV opened. The first man out needed no introduction to the crowd, though his appearance had changed drastically. Cal Rourke stepped onto the lawn, but the gray t-shirt and road dust were gone. In their place, he wore the crisp, brilliant white dress uniform of a United States Navy petty officer. The high collar, the gold buttons, and the colorful rows of ribbons on his chest caught the sun, creating an aura of undeniable authority. Over his left breast, the metal trident of the Navy SEALs gleamed like a warning. At his side, Shadow sat at a perfect heel, wearing a tactical vest that marked him as a working military K-9. Stepping out from the other side of the car was a man who offered a stark contrast to Cal's military splendor. Agent Marcus Dunn was a man in his 40s with a receding hairline and wire-rimmed glasses that hid eyes as sharp as a scalpel. He wore an ill-fitting charcoal suit in a way that suggested he was too busy catching criminals to see a tailor. He carried a leather briefcase and walked with a humble, shuffling gait that led people to underestimate him until it was too late. Behind them, 4 uniformed state troopers emerged from the patrol cars, their hats pulled low, their hands resting near their belts. Cal didn't wait for an invitation. He walked directly toward the stage, his path cutting through the crowd like an icebreaker through a frozen sea. The guests, realizing this was not part of the entertainment, parted quickly, murmuring furiously. Harrison Sterling Sr. stood on the stage, his smile faltering for the first time. Security, he barked into the microphone, his composure cracking. Remove these intruders. Sheriff Jones, who had been enjoying the buffet near the stage, lunged forward, wiping crumbs from his mouth. He looked flushed and panicked, reaching for his radio. "You!" Jones shouted, waddling toward Cal. "I told you to get out of town. You're trespassing on private property. I'm placing you under arrest." Agent Dunn stepped in front of Jones, intercepting him with surprising speed. He didn't raise his voice. He simply held up a badge identifying him as a federal agent with the FBI. "Stand down, Sheriff," Dunn said, his voice dry and bored. "You are now the subject of a federal corruption investigation. If you so much as touch your radio or your weapon, these state troopers will put you on the ground, and they are not gentle." Jones froze, his mouth opening and closing like a fish on a dock. The color drained from his face as 2 of the troopers moved in, flanking him and relieving him of his weapon. Cal continued to the stage. He climbed the steps, the wood thudding under his polished dress shoes. Spencer Jr. shrank behind his father, his fake sling trembling. "Stay away from me!" Spencer III shrieked. "He's going to kill us." Cal ignored the son and looked directly at the father. Sterling tried to rally his arrogance. "Do you have any idea who I am? I will have you court-martialed. I will bury you." Cal reached out and calmly took the microphone from Sterling's hand. The sound of his breath boomed from the speakers. "My name is Petty Officer Caleb Rourke," Cal announced, his voice ringing out across the lawn, carrying to every stunned guest and the local news crew Sterling had hired to cover the event. "And I am not here to interrupt your party. I am here to present the facts." He nodded to Dunn, who had moved to the AV system controls. The FBI agent plugged a flash drive into the laptop. The LED screen behind the stage flickered and the image of Charity vanished. In its place, the grainy but clear security footage from the Anchor Grill appeared. A collective gasp went through the crowd. On the massive screen, everyone saw Spencer Sterling Jr., not as a victim, but as a predator. They saw him trip Leah. They saw Madison slap her. They saw Spencer grab the waitress by the hair and slam her face into the table. There was no sound, but the violence was undeniable. Then the screen changed. It showed a screenshot of a text message chain. The sender was clearly identified as Spencer Jr. and the recipient was Gage. The text was magnified. "Make sure he can't walk. Bring the dog to the Marina warehouse. Dad wants this done before the charity gala tomorrow. No mistakes." The silence on the lawn was absolute. It was the silence of a facade shattering. The wealthy elite of Blackwater Creek looked from the screen to the man they had been toasting, horror and disgust plain on their faces. Cal turned to Harrison Sterling Sr. You didn't just bully a waitress, Cal said, his voice cold and hard. You ordered a hit on a federal service member. You conspired to kidnap a working military K-9. And you used your local sheriff as a cover-up. Sterling Sr. looked around, seeing his empire crumbling in real time. He saw the judgment in the eyes of his peers, the camera lenses pointed at him, and the state troopers marching up the stairs. This is doctored, he screamed, his voice cracking. It's a deepfake. It's a conspiracy. But no one was listening. Agent Dunn stepped onto the stage. Harrison Sterling Sr., Spencer Sterling Jr., Dunn said, his voice devoid of emotion. You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit assault, bribery of a public official, and multiple counts of racketeering. You have the right to remain silent. As the troopers cuffed the father and son, the scene descended into chaos. Spencer Jr. was sobbing, begging his father to fix it. Sterling was screaming threats about his lawyers. Madison Croft tried to slip away into the crowd, but a female trooper blocked her path, requesting a statement regarding the assault in the diner. Down below the stage, Sheriff Jones was having his badge removed from his chest by the state police captain. He looked small and defeated, the power he had abused for years stripped away in seconds. Cal stood at the edge of the stage, Shadow sitting majestically at his side. He watched the arrests with a stoic expression. He wasn't smiling. This wasn't a victory lap. It was a necessary cleansing. He looked out at the crowd, who were still staring at him in awe. He caught the eye of the news cameraman and gave a single, firm nod. The message had been sent. The Sterlings were not untouchable. The shadows they had used to control the town had been burned away by the light of truth, brought by a man in white. 7 days had passed since the storm of justice had swept through Blackwater Creek, and the town had undergone a transformation that was nothing short of miraculous. The oppressive, stagnant atmosphere that had hung over the streets like a shroud was gone, blown away by the clean, fresh winds that swept in from Lake Erie. It was early morning, the kind of crystal-clear coastal morning where the sky was an endless expanse of robin's egg blue, and the sunlight felt more like a warm embrace than a hammer blow. At the Anchor Grill, the open sign was on, but it was hardly necessary. The parking lot was already full, not with flashy sports cars, but with the rusted, reliable pickup trucks of fishermen, the sedans of schoolteachers, and the bicycles of kids on summer break. Inside, the diner vibrated with energy. It wasn't the hushed, fearful silence of before, nor the tense murmur of gossip. It was the loud, boisterous sound of a community reclaiming its space. The smell of frying bacon and brewing coffee spilled out into the street, acting as a beacon. Leah Carter moved through this chaos with a new kind of grace. She was no longer the hunched, fearful girl trying to make herself invisible. She wore her uniform with her shoulders straight and her head held high. Her strawberry blonde hair was still pulled back, but the dark circles under her eyes were gone, replaced by a brightness that matched the morning sun. Customers didn't just order, they greeted her by name, asked after her grandmother, and left tips that were far larger than the bill required. There was a protective air around her. The regulars, led by Mr. Henderson, had now formed an unofficial security detail, ensuring that everyone who walked through the door treated the staff with respect. The diner had become a symbol of their victory, a place where the ordinary people of Blackwater Creek celebrated the fact that they no longer had to live under the thumb of the Sterlings. Even the air conditioner seemed to work better, humming a steady, contented rhythm, as if it, too, felt the town's relief. Away from the bustle of the diner, at the little house on Elm Street, a different kind of work was coming to an end. Cal Rourke stood by the newly repaired fence, wiping his hands on a rag. Over the past week, the dilapidated property had been transformed. The sagging porch was now level and strong, the rotting wood replaced with sturdy, treated planks that smelled of pine and permanence. The peeling yellow paint had been scraped away and replaced with a coat of clean, new white that gleamed in the morning sun. The gate, once hanging askew, now swung smoothly on heavy-duty hinges, latching with a satisfying click. It wasn't a mansion, but it was a fortress of dignity. Cal surveyed his work with a craftsman's critical eye, checking for any missed spots or loose screws. Finding none, he nodded to himself. His mission here was complete. Shadow was lying on the lush green grass of the front lawn, contentedly chewing on a new rubber toy that Eleanor had bought for him. The German Shepherd looked relaxed, his ears held at a soft half-mast as he soaked in the peace. He had spent the week patrolling the yard, but the threats were gone. The black SUVs of the Sterling security detail were gone, replaced by the occasional friendly wave from a neighbor walking their dog. The fear was gone. Cal let out a low whistle, a two-note signal, and Shadow instantly dropped the toy, got to his feet, and trotted to his master's side, ready for the next command. Cal gave the dog a soft pat on the flank. "Time to go, Buddy, he murmured. He walked up the porch steps, the new wood solid under his boots, to where Eleanor and Leah were waiting. Eleanor sat in her wheelchair, a blanket across her lap, watching Cal with eyes that held a lifetime of wisdom. She wasn't crying. She was not a woman for tearful goodbyes. Instead, she held out her hand and took Cal's large, rough hand in her own frail ones. "You fixed more than the house, Mr. Rourke," she said, her voice raspy but firm. "You fixed the foundation of this family. We were sinking and you pulled us up." Cal shook his head slightly, uncomfortable with the praise. "I just hammered some nails, ma'am. You two did the hard part. You survived." Eleanor squeezed his hand. "Don't sell yourself short. The world needs men who build fences, not just men who tear them down. You travel safe." She released his hand, giving Shadow one last scratch behind the ears, murmuring a thank you to the silent guardian. Leah stood by the railing, twisting a dish towel in her hands, struggling to find the words. She had spent the last week watching this stranger work tirelessly for them, asking for nothing. He had saved her dignity in the diner, saved her home from her landlord, and saved her town from a tyrant. "I don't know how we can ever repay you," she said, her voice catching slightly. "The materials, your time. We don't have much." Cal stopped her with a raised hand. He reached into the pocket of his tactical pants and pulled out a small, heavy object. He took Leah's hand and pressed the object into her palm, closing her fingers around it. Leah opened her hand. Lying on her palm was a heavy, bronze coin about the size of a silver dollar. On one side, it bore the intricately stamped emblem of a Navy SEAL team, an eagle, a trident, an anchor, and a pistol. On the other, a Latin inscription that meant strength and honor. It was a challenge coin, a symbol of brotherhood, respect, and belonging. "You don't owe me anything," Cal said, his voice low and serious, looking directly into her eyes. "That's a unit coin. We only give those to members of the team, people who have faced the fire and didn't run. You stood up to them, Leah. You kept going when it was hard. That makes you one of us." He smiled, a rare, genuine expression that reached his eyes. "If you ever feel scared or weak, you hold on to that and remember you've got a brother out there who has your back." Leah clutched the coin to her chest, the tears finally coming, but they were tears of happiness. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you, Caleb." He gave her a single nod, a sharp, military acknowledgement. He didn't linger. Long goodbyes were not his style. He turned and walked down the steps, Shadow falling into step at his left heel. They moved with the same synchronized purpose as the day they had arrived. A man and his animal, always moving forward. Cal threw his duffel bag into the truck bed and opened the passenger door for Shadow, who hopped in with easy grace. Cal climbed into the driver's seat, the engine rumbling to life with a low, throaty growl that sounded like a waking beast. He backed the massive black truck out of the driveway, the tires crunching on the gravel. He paused for a moment on the street, looking back at the little white house with the marigolds in the windows. Leah was on the porch, waving, the bronze coin glinting in the sun. Eleanor raised a hand in farewell. Cal tapped the horn once, 2 short blasts, a final salute to the civilians he had served. Then he put the truck in drive and pulled away. The truck moved down the street, turning onto the main coastal road. The windows were down, and Cal rested his arm on the doorframe, feeling the cool lake air rush past. Shadow had his head out the wind, his tongue lolling, his eyes squinted against the sun. As they picked up speed, the town of Blackwater Creek began to fade in the rearview mirror. The diner, the docks, the mansion on the hill. They all receded into the distance. The road ahead was open, a ribbon of asphalt stretching along the cliffs, bordered by the endless blue of Lake Erie on one side and the towering green forests on the other. Caleb Rourke was a soldier, a traveler, a shadow who moved between light and darkness. He had brought the storm to the wicked and the sun to the righteous, and now his work here was done. But as the truck disappeared around a bend, dissolving into the bright morning light, the feeling he left behind remained, a solid, unshakable belief that as long as there were men like him, the world was a little less lonely, and justice was never truly out of reach.